Hi, I'm Emma, and today I'm going to be talking about the topic of my MA dissertation, St Oswald's Parish, Durham. If you've walked along Church Street to the Bill Bryson Library in Durham, then you will have seen this church. Pictured here in an early 20th century sketch, the churchyard of St Oswald and its parish church provide a glimpse into early modern Durham. Inside the church are monuments to the great men of the parish stretching across the centuries, and outside, if you step into the grass at the rear of the churchyard, you can uncover graves going back up to the 18th century. St Oswald's parish is fascinating for its breadth. It stretched miles from Elvet and Crossgate in this modern city of Durham, out into settlements such as Shincliffe, Butterby, Croxdale and Broome. There was the main church and also a chapel at St Margaret's, which you can still see today on Crossgate. In this presentation, looking predominantly through the lens of documents relating to illness and death, I will consider how far the boundaries of the parish affected the lives of residents. The majority of this presentation focuses on some quite gloomy topics, but before there is death, there is life. As discussed in the 17th century visitations of the Bishop of Durham, and generally a part of life across early modern England, the boundaries of a parish were to be symbolically walked each year in what were known as rogations. For a parish as dispersed as St Oswald's, this would have been a time-consuming but highly meaningful task for those involved. Within the parish register, births and marriages show both the connections of the parish to the wider world, but also the potential for many individuals to have lived their entire lives largely within its boundaries. Finally, a court case example from the mid-18th century will show how for many people, social connections with the wider Durham community were very important to them. One way of looking at the parish register to uncover details about communal life is to use baptisms, marriages and death records to conduct a family reconstitution where you try and track families over time. This is what I'm currently doing for my dissertation, and it's really helpful to see where individual people's lives come in and out of the parish boundaries. John Adamson was born in 1725, the son of a labourer, William Adamson. He married Anne Brown from Auckland Parish, and they lived in Shincliffe, having 4 children between 1736 and 1744. On its own, this information is of very little interest, but when combined with other stories, it will be possible for me to make inferences about the wider community. In the meantime, however, it is the experience of outsiders within the parish that stand out. The example given on the slide shows vividly the very real consequences of being an outsider without a community to belong to. The unnamed woman gave birth in a field to one child who lives and one child who died, too far away to gain any assistance from those around her. In addition to outsiders having children within the boundaries of the parish, the women of St Oswald also sometimes became pregnant to those from outside the community. This is especially the case during the English Civil War. In a single month, April 1642, 4 children were baptised whose fathers were soldiers in the Scottish Army. St Oswald's was clearly not a closed community, completely cut off from the implications of the Civil War. This sociogram shows the marriages between 1538 and 1751 in the parish, grouped by surname. In the centre of the diagram are the surnames for which there are many marriages to be found. Some of these because of the commonality of the surname, and others because the family was so prolific within the parish. On the outskirts of the graph are those which appear only once or twice. My finished family reconstitution for the parish will go into more detail on the experiences of individual families, but a basic analysis of surname data such as this shows the way that some people moved in and out of parishes over the course of their lifetime and their families' lifetimes. Just over 2,000 marriages are recorded between 1538 and 1751 in the parish, and for around 850 of these, a location is given for either the husband or the wife. For the vast majority, both partners are from St Oswald's parish itself. In some cases, however, marriages with people from outside the community took place. This graph shows the origins of men from outside the parish who married women from St Oswald's, excluding those who are listed as coming from smaller communities such as Shincliffe. The places, as shown on the graph, are predominantly from within the north, mostly within the boundaries of the Palatinate of Durham, from Newcastle or from Yorkshire. Only one of the men is from London, for example, although many women married men from within St Oswald's and even within the smaller communities that they were part of, such as Burnhall. Many women in St Oswald's built connections to other northern communities and left the parish to live in those. Where the occupations of the men from the graph are given, these are unsurprisingly often of the middling sort. Craftsmen, they had occupations such as being a saddler or a tailor. A labourer would have far less opportunity to meet people from further afield. When thinking about illness and death in early modern England, it is often scenes like this which come to mind. This image, taken from a 17th century plague pamphlet called Road for Runaways, shows a spectre of death looming over the city of London. In this section of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the experience of individuals within St Oswald's parish, before talking about neighbourliness and strangers within the parish register. I'll then speak a little bit about infant mortality before finishing by discussing one of the major crises in the early modern period in the parish, which is the mortality crisis of 1644 to 1645. This monument in St Oswald's Church is to Christopher Chater, who died in 1592. His son Thomas's diary is a key source for life within the parish at the start of the 17th century. It is filled with references to his and his family's illnesses, showing reflection on mortality and providence as an important part of his everyday life. The diary of Christopher Sanderson, elsewhere in the county of Durham, was similar in tone. Chater's will shows the diversity of his interests across parish boundaries, as well as financial transactions with three individuals who were born or married in St Oswald's: Thomas Cook, George Martin, and John Lambden. He also references land at Kellow. His geographically spread interests are influenced by his personal circumstances. On the flip side, individuals could be highly reliant on close family connections within their parish. Elizabeth Lambden, who died in 1713, gave heartfelt thanks in her will to her cousin for all of the support he had given her, including providing her food. Aside from a small bequest to a half-sister, she left everything to him. For those with more limited resources, the geographical closeness of family and friends will be highly significant. In the 17th century, Glover Jacob B. from St Margaret's Parish in the city of Durham reflected on life and death in his community. As well as recording disagreements he had heard about and noting down his financial transactions, B recorded births, marriages, and deaths. Residents of St Oswald's Parish were recorded far more infrequently by B than those in parishes such as St Nicholas and St Margaret's, but there is a pattern to those who B felt were worthy of inclusion or whose deaths he is aware of. Firstly, there are those in trades adjacent to his own. For example, there are tailors mentioned such as Richard Home. Likewise, Elva is a key location. The streets of Elva and around the chapelry at Crossgate are the areas of St Oswald's Parish which were directly connected to life within the city of Durham itself. More rural areas of the parish were far more removed. Individuals are often of similar middling status to B himself. When this is not the case, they are often mentioned because there is an interesting aspect to their death itself. For example, on September 7, 1700, a servant returning from a lime kiln fell down on clay path and never spoke more. Within the parish register, the biographical information recorded at the death of an individual was often limited to their occupation or familial links. For just a few dozen of the over 8,000 deaths recorded in the parish register between 1538 and 1751, there are explicit references to the character of the deceased. These are most often found referring to wealthy individuals. For example, the wife of Christopher Chater was described as a virtuous and a godly gentlewoman. Or John Lambden, who was once mayor of the city, he died in his 70s as a very honest and religious gentleman, good to the poor. Craftsmen such as blacksmith John Fairless and pewterer Nicholas Mann are given reference in the parish register to their position as very honest neighbours. These references are especially prominent during the late 16th century and into the 1630s before disappearing. They reappear briefly at the start of the 18th century. This may be linked to a change in the usage of the parish register following an Act of Parliament made in 1653 under Oliver Cromwell. A new parish register was produced at that time. Events such as storms and floods, however, are still recorded in the register. The decline, therefore, may be linked instead to what historians have described as the decline of neighbourliness. Interestingly, the 18th century references to the character of the deceased focus upon their status as a good housekeeper, which has a slightly more domestic focus than early comments about being an honest neighbour. So far, I have largely presented an inclusive community, focusing on the sense of belonging fostered both within individual settlements of the parish and between St Oswald's and neighbouring parishes and communities. However, a key aspect of this belonging is that belonging is conditional. For those born outside the parish, being welcome is linked to status and to being known. Someone with credit would be welcome, whereas a poor person would be a burden upon the community and could be actively resisted. The background to this slide shows some of the descriptions used to describe individuals from outside the parish who had died there. These are predominantly travelling beggars who were completely unknown. Parish officials would make attempts to remove poor people to prevent having to pay them poor relief if they weren't from the parish. Surviving 18th and 19th century settlement certificates show the extent to which officials had to go to avoid paying relief. For example, Elizabeth Bowness and her 3 children, aged between 2 and 10, were to be escorted from St Oswald's to Gisborough in the county of York. While individuals did marry those from outside St Oswald's, it was still vitally important to prevent undesirable outsiders from gaining access to the community and its resources. While doing the research for my dissertation, searching on early English books online for pamphlets and documents relating to life in early modern Durham, one in particular stood out. This pamphlet is from the late 17th century and it tells of a woman called Elizabeth her surname isn't given, who's from Durham, and she goes to London, she falls pregnant, comes home to Durham, and then subsequently murders her infant child. Interesting part of this story for me was the vivid descriptions of the deceased child then haunting the woman, providing a in the pamphlet following the murder, there are vivid descriptions of the deceased child literally haunting a woman, and this serves as part of the warning against infanticide. When you actually look into whether this case was true, though, there are no mentions in newspapers like the Newcastle Courant of a woman called Elizabeth being indicted for murder or a similar charge around 1679, and you can't access the court documents during lockdown. So the text is interesting more for what it isn't than what it is. So when you think about the wider concept of community, this woman in this story leaves London and returns to Durham, and even if this never actually happened, this shows the importance of the community to which you were born during times of personal crisis. Moving on to the everyday reality of this issue. The Articles of Inquiry produced by the Bishop of Durham in 1662 explicitly reference the need for dying children to be baptised, and the parish register frequently refers to the death of young children. Infant mortality was a fact of life, and especially at the beginning of the period, could represent a significant portion of overall mortality. For example, of all those dying from April 1578 to March 1578, Old Style date, 16 were aged, 8 were infants, and only 4 were of another unrecorded age. Looking into specifics now, the case of the foundling Francis in 1750 is quite interesting. This child was found in Durham Cathedral, and there is no sign of her in any of the lockdown accessible records, no newspaper mentions of the death of the foundling within the cathedral. Yet it was seen as a significant enough occurrence for the parish clerk of Oswald, another parish entirely, to note it down in the register. This suggests that it may have been discussed in the city and the parish when it happened, and may have been a matter of some shock for the community. Comparing this real case of a dead child and a monstrous child in the pamphlet, the difference between fiction and reality can be seen. When thinking about how a community comes together or falters, one of the main things that comes to mind is a moment of crisis. For the community of St Oswald's Parish, one of the biggest crises they ever faced was the plague epidemic that came during the English Civil War. From 1644 to November 1645, 305 deaths are recorded in the parish register. 141 were recorded at the time, and the remainder were added to the parish register years later, with the subsequent disruption to the parish register showing the highly significant impact of this crisis upon the community. Some people's deaths aren't listed by name, they are merely the children of one person or another. The scarce number of marriages which were recorded during the crisis can also be used to tentatively suggest a movement towards marriages within the community. Whereas individuals in 1643 had married people from Brancepeth, Wearmouth, and other outside locations, the community moved closer during the crisis. A man from Aycliffe, outside the parish, married a woman from Aycliffe, while all the other marriages with locations referred to Oswald or to places such as Shincliffe. Scott and Duncan's research on this epidemic suggests the community may have had some prior exposure to the disease, because a lot of the deaths there was a single person dying within a family. However, my family reconstitution of the parish that I'm in the process of doing shows just how significant the impact of one single year could be upon individual parts of the community. The life story of Simon Lodge is a perfect example of what the mortality crisis of 1644 to 1645 did to some families within St Oswald's Parish. Simon was a felt maker, and he was married to a woman called Anne. Their marriage is not recorded in the parish register. He had a child called William who had died a few years previously, but otherwise the family is not visible in the register prior to 1645. In the course of a single month, Simon's life is changed forever. He loses his son Thomas, another child, his wife, and his 2 daughters, Joan and Elizabeth. In the course of a single month, he's lost 4 children and his life partner. Because of the sparsity of the records of this time, it is not possible to know properly whether Simon had other children by 1644. He did have a daughter, Jane, who died in 1655, but her birth is not recorded. His decision to remarry quite quickly, however, may be a survival strategy designed to help protect his other children if he did have them. So he marries a woman called Jane, and they have a daughter, Margaret, who was born in 1646. Simon dies in the mid-1650s, having lost at least 6 children during his lifetime. By winter of 1660, both his wife Jane and his last known surviving child Margaret have both perished. From the perspective of the St Oswald's Parish Register, at this moment the family had been wiped out. The life of Henry Farrow gives another example of the brutality of this crisis. Over the course of a 20-year period, he and his wife Elizabeth had 10 children, of which 8 were still alive at the start of 1644. The loss of his infant children, Henry and Catherine, is followed in 1645 by colossal losses. Henry dies, alongside 5 of his children. Who the surviving child is not recorded. It may, for example, have been Clement, who was born in 1626. There is a Clement Farrar who died in the parish decades later, and in his will he lists only his wife and daughter as his sole inheritors. This would match up with what had happened with the Farrar family earlier, if this was the case. In this presentation, I've briefly talked about individual family reconstitutions, the examples of Farrar and Lodge. In my dissertation, I'm going to broaden the lens to consider wider inheritance patterns and the aspects of community life that can be shown looking at many families in this way. So if you have any questions about these broader perspectives or want to see more of the family trees I've been reconstituting, I'd be happy to discuss those in the comments section. The period I'm studying stretches from the reign of Henry VIII to the eve of the changes made to the calendar system in 1752. I've talked in this presentation in broad terms about some of the aspects of life and death within St Oswald's. The lives of many people, especially the most fortunate, were able to transcend the boundaries of the parish. People lived and died not only in St Oswald's but within a broader Durham community. We are often removed, though, from the lives of the most marginal, especially as we look further back into the past. Studying a community such as St Oswald's, you can see the different experiences of those who belong and those such as the travelling poor who are forever outsiders. For a more affluent individual, crossing the parish boundaries was a matter of day-to-day life. They may move into the city to work or travel further afield on business. For the poor relief provided by the parish was vital to their continued survival. It is on that level, perhaps, thinking about the more marginal, that the boundaries of the parish are, of course, far more significant.